The United States is in the midst of the deadliest drug epidemic in our nation's history, caused by some of the most lethal drugs ever created. More than 108,000 Americans died last year from drugs. More than 108,000, almost double the number of Americans killed in the entire Vietnam War. That is the worst slaughter of American citizens by drug dealers and traffickers on record. The biggest killers by far were lab-made opioids, most notably fentanyl, which are cheap to produce and easy to mix with other street drugs. These lethal cocktails have devastated countless families and communities across our nation. Too many parents have come home to a dead child who mistakenly took a prescription pill or a so-called party drug that might have been laced with fentanyl. Indeed, almost no one dies of a fentanyl overdose thinking they took fentanyl. It is laced into other drugs. That's why repeatedly over the past 2 years, I and many of my colleagues have offered a measure to keep it illegal to traffic new variants of fentanyl. But each time, a Democrat has blocked that measure. Later today, they will do so again. But perhaps we can at least agree on one thing. We should have no tolerance for people who willingly trick addicted drug users or other innocent persons into taking deadly fentanyl by telling them it's really something else. And this happens every day with heartbreaking consequences across the country. For example, just 2 weeks ago, a drug trafficker was sentenced to life in prison for his role in distributing fentanyl to unsuspecting users in Minnesota. 11 people died. They thought they were buying illicit Adderall. When he heard about the deaths, the dealer asked his Chinese suppliers for a discount on his next shipment. That same week, another drug dealer was arrested just minutes from the Capitol building where we stand in Silver Spring, Maryland, for killing a child with a fentanyl pill, which he said was Percocet. He was hiding the fentanyl-laced fake Percocet pills inside small bags of marijuana. Last week, a few minutes in the other direction, a trafficker was tried in Northern Virginia for distributing cocaine laced with fentanyl at a party. 6 partygoers overdosed, 1 died. These cases happen every day. Drug addicts are especially lulled into a false sense of safety by fake prescription pills, believing them to be medicine for which they have some past experience. That's why fake prescription drugs are on the rise. Federal law enforcement encountered as many fake prescription pills in 2021 as in the previous 2 years combined. If Democrats refuse to help Republicans keep all fentanyl variants off the streets, hopefully we can at least agree on keeping deceptive fentanyl traffickers behind bars. My bill will establish that any drug trafficker who knowingly misrepresents fentanyl as though it is something else would be subject to 20 years in prison. If the criminal has a prior felony criminal record, or if misrepresentation kills someone, then the criminal would be subject to life in prison, or even eligible for the death penalty. There can simply be no leniency for people who trick unsuspecting users into taking deadly fentanyl. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Bill 4984, which is at the desk. I further ask that the bill be considered read, 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object.
The Democratic whip.
Madam President, I learned this morning that the senator from Arkansas was going to offer this unanimous consent request on the floor of the Senate this afternoon. I was a little bit surprised. I wasn't aware of this bill. We've been members of the same committee, the Judiciary Committee, for 21 months, and the senator from Arkansas has not raised the bill during that period of time. But it's his right to come to the floor today and ask that it be considered. And I'd like to tell you why I'm going to object to this. If you serve in Congress any period of time, you become a student of the terrible drug problems of America. I recall a period of time in the House of Representatives when we had crack cocaine appear in the United States for the first time. It scared us because it was cheap, it was deadly addictive, and women who were pregnant who took it did harm to the baby they were carrying. And so we decided to make sure that we were going to do the right thing in our war on drugs. And what we said was, listen closely, that the penalty for crack cocaine would be 100 times the penalty for use of ordinary cocaine. 100 times. And the penalty for using cocaine in general was already serious. 100 times, war on drugs. I voted for it. And I thought, finally, a message will come from the Congress that if you touch crack cocaine, you're going to be in for it. And we expected that fewer people would do it because of the fear of that criminal sentencing, and that the price of crack cocaine would go up because the demand was limited. Guess what happened? Exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. More and more people used crack cocaine, and the price on the street went down to dirt level. And the result was we started filling our prisons in a way that we'd never seen before in the history of the United States. 500% of the prison population of just 20 or 30 years ago increased in that period of time. And we learned the hard way that getting tough wasn't always the smart way to deal with drug addiction. We thought about it, and we changed the law several times. I've been party to changing it. I voted for the original version, and it failed, and we had to do better. And then something happened that was dramatic. Opioids. Out of nowhere came opioids. And what used to be a problem of drug addiction and death in the inner cities of America became a problem of drug addiction and death in the suburbs of America, in the farm towns of America, all over America. And interestingly enough, America started looking at our drug laws and our drug addiction and saying, what are we doing wrong here? What's wrong with this situation? And as a consequence, a lot of attitudes changed. People got away from the old just say no routine and started asking serious questions. How do we deal with drug addiction? How do we stop this addiction? And it's not easy to stop it, and God knows we need to. And so we've seen a transformation with the arrival of opioids. Now, the senator from Arkansas is correct. People are lacing these opioids with fentanyl, and fentanyl is deadly. There's no question about it. And we should take it seriously, and we do. Matter of fact, each judge, when they're imposing a sentence for crimes already involving fentanyl, are pretty serious about it. I just heard the senator from Arkansas describe a situation where someone in Minnesota got life in prison for the sale of a fentanyl product. So it's clear that it's not being ignored, nor should it be. Intentionally selling fentanyl is already a crime all over the United States. Representing that fentanyl is something else is exactly the kind of aggravating factor a judge takes into account in sentencing. I don't believe this bill is a serious effort to deal with the problem in light of what we know today. Start with, it creates a new federal death penalty offense. Well, I have to tell you, I have watched a lifetime, a political lifetime of death penalty cases and seen the result. And I have my serious doubts that that is the best way for America to go. I think the gentleman from Arkansas realizes that. I'm the lead sponsor, along with 20 others, of the Federal Death Penalty Prohibition Act to repeal it once and for all. So I'm concerned about any legislation that imposes the death penalty. It also creates mandatory minimum sentences that don't allow judges to consider the individual circumstances in a case. That is straight out of the failed doctrine of the war on drugs. Mandatory minimum. Tie the judge's hand, put people in jail, and basically say unlimited amounts of time that they'll spend there. People were getting 20 and 30 years sentences for the sale of narcotics like crack cocaine. and we soon realized that it didn't make sense over the long haul. 20 years for a single drug sale that goes up to mandatory life in prison if the defendant has any prior felony conviction, no matter if it has zero relationship to drugs or based on a defendant's immigration status. I don't believe that is the right way to go. It wasn't with the war on drugs. We learned the hard way. I want to get tough on the drug salesman. I'm sure the senator from Arkansas feels the same way. We approach it differently. I have the experience of trying to take the hard position on this issue and seeing that it failed us when it came to crack cocaine, and for that reason I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, what we heard is a
The
lot of the
junior
same.
senator from Arkansas.
What we heard is a lot of the same excuses that Democrats have made for years about being soft on crime. Claims about mass incarceration or systemic racism or what have you. I would point out that almost no one is in federal prison for mere drug possession. It is a myth that there are low-level, non-violent offenders in prison because they're addicted to drugs. What we are at is a 21-year low in the number of federal inmates that we have. You know what we're not at? A 21-year low in drug deaths, the highest on record. Every single year, year after year, almost twice as many died in the Vietnam War, almost 24 times as many died in the entire Iraq War, almost 35 times as many died on 9/11. Yet Democrats repeatedly refuse to crack down on deceptive fentanyl dealers. As I mentioned, I've also offered bills in the past that would permanently add fentanyl to the Controlled Substance Act scheduling. The Democrats refuse to do so. They'll do it temporarily for time to time, but they want to trade. They want to get a trade for something. They want to either reduce sentences or let prisoners out, whether they're Democratic senators or Democratic governors in places like Illinois, eliminating the bail system, Democratic mayors and Democratic prosecuting attorneys in places like Chicago. And as a result, we have a crime wave and a drug epidemic all across America. And let me just reiterate, the bill I just offered that the senator from Illinois blocked, it would simply say you cannot sell another drug and not acknowledge that fentanyl is in it. You cannot misrepresent what you're selling. It's not just opioids. It's not just heroin. It's even marijuana. It's pills that are passed off as mere prescription drugs, like in some of the examples I gave, Adderall, OxyContin, Percocet, that people all across America are dying from. Well, let's take another angle on this problem. Almost all of these drugs come from Mexico. Almost all the drugs in America today come from Mexico. They almost all come from a handful of vicious, depraved cartels in Mexico. Cartels that have taken on the powers of a quasi-state. Cartels that the Mexican government either cannot or will not crack down on. So let's look at it from that perspective. It's past time that we bring the full weight of the United States government to bear on these cartels and to destroy them for what they're unleashing on our streets. Imagine if ISIS or Al-Qaeda set up shop across our border and was responsible for more than 100,000 American deaths every single year. What would we do? What would you do? I know what we wouldn't do. We wouldn't hesitate to act. And that's exactly what we should do with these Mexican cartels. Unfortunately, President Biden has done the opposite. Since the day he took office, he has flung open our borders, created a border crisis, and made it easier than ever to smuggle massive amounts of illegal drugs into the United States. Already this year, the Border Patrol has found over 12,000 pounds of fentanyl being smuggled over our border. 12,000 pounds. You may not be able to put that in perspective. Let me put it in perspective for you. It is enough to kill every man, woman, and child in America many, many times over. That doesn't even include any fentanyl brought in by the hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens who the DHS calls gotaways. President Biden could declare the fentanyl peddling cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations, but he has refused to do so. So the bill that I'm about to bring up would give him additional tools, short of labeling these cartels terrorists. My bill would create a new designation called a significant transnational criminal organization and it would enable the federal government to impose many of the same sanctions and use many of the same tools against cartels that it already does against terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Those would include barring cartel members and their immediate families from entering the United States, freezing assets belonging to the cartels to hit their wallets, and to keep them from profiting off of death and destruction, and enabling civil and criminal penalties for anyone who provides material assistance or resources to cartels. Now, the Democrats have just blocked my bill that would keep new fentanyl variants illegal. They've just blocked another bill that would target they're going to block a bill later today that would keep new fentanyl variants illegal. They just blocked another bill that would target drug traffickers who trick people into taking fentanyl that kills them. I hope at least Democratic senators would be willing to say that we should give the Biden administration more tools to use against the Mexican cartels, some of the worst and most depraved criminals on earth. Therefore, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of my bill, Senate Bill 621, the Significant Transnational Criminal Organization Designation Act, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Objection.
Serving the right to object.
The Democratic whip.
The senator from Arkansas's views on immigration are well known. He's been consistent in opposing immigration. But it's interesting to me that people like him who oppose immigration always at the end seem to go after the same people, mothers and children. We saw it with the cages that kids were kept in. We saw it when kids were forcibly removed from their parents at the border during the Trump years. We've seen it time and again, and now we see it with the governor of Florida and the governor of Texas putting mothers and children on buses and busing them off hundreds of miles away from where they were picked up, whether there's any contact there or not. Mothers and children are always a focal point of anti-immigration rhetoric, and once again, this bill does that. I agree completely when it comes to stopping transnational criminal organizations, but to focus the bill on innocent spouses and children, including minor children, and make them the target of the bill seems to me going beyond any reasonable law enforcement. There is a narrow exception in the bill that allows a spouse or child to be admitted to the United States if they can somehow convince the consular officer that they did not know or could not reasonably have known their spouse or parent's membership in a criminal organization. But there's no exception for battered spouses or children who are often victims of these organizations themselves. And the bill gives what appears to be unreviewable discretion to these consular offices to decide whether an innocent spouse or child has renounced the organization. These transnational criminal organizations must be sanctioned and stopped, but this is not the way to do it, going after mothers and children. And I want to make a point, since the senator concluded after my last statement that I am somehow soft on crime. Could I go through a short list here of bills that I voted for to get tough on crime? Let's take a look at this bill, the American Rescue Plan. That American Rescue Plan passed in the United States Senate and provided billions of dollars to state and local communities for police and crime protection. More money for police and crime protection from this Senate to those communities. I voted for it. The senator from Arkansas voted against it. Then the Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In that bill was $430 million investment in our ports of entry, helping DHS to screen vehicles for fentanyl. You see these drugs come through ports of entry. This idea of a backpack full of drugs being hiked over the border by someone in the middle of the night, that's not where the bulk of these drugs come from. They come through the port of entry. So we put $430 million investment to make those ports of entry even stronger and tougher, and I agree with that completely, helping Department of Homeland Security to screen vehicles to stop fentanyl from coming in. I voted for that. The senator from Arkansas voted no. Who's soft on crime? Then we passed the March Omnibus Appropriations Bill, tens of millions of dollars in increased funding for hiring police officers and technology upgrades at the border to detect and seize fentanyl and other illicit cargo. I voted for that. The senator from Arkansas voted against it. Who's soft on crime? And when we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the most serious bipartisan step Congress has taken to end gun violence in 30 years, I voted for it. The senator from Arkansas voted against it. Who's soft on crime? The American people can see which party is passing legislation actually funds law enforcement, addresses crime and violence in a thoughtful way. And they can see when the bills come up on the floor, one party gives the speeches, the other party gives the votes. I'm going to continue to vote to support the police and put an end to this drug crisis in America in a thoughtful and sensible way. I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
The junior senator from Arkansas.
I think we know who's soft on crime. It sounds like I hit a nerve. I didn't stand up here saying I'm not soft on crime 5 or 6 times in a row. It's the senator from Illinois who said that, just like Senate Democrats have been saying it for the last several months, just like their candidates all across America are saying it. But let's look at the first bill he mentioned, the American Rescue Plan. You know what that is, right? The American Rescue Plan? That's their $2 trillion wasteful spending bill from last spring. That's responsible for 13% inflation. You know what also included in it? A measure that would give stimulus checks to prisoners. That's right, depraved, violent felons, murderers and rapists and drug traffickers all across America. People like the Boston Marathon bomber got stimulus checks last year because the Democrats believe that criminals are really at heart victims as well, victims of an oppressive society and system. If I'm not mistaken, when I offered my amendment to prevent prisoners from getting stimulus checks, I think it was the senator from Illinois who stood up and blocked it. I know that he voted against it. I know that he wanted prisoners to get stimulus checks. That's what he's talking about. Or what about his objection to this bill that it's going to target mothers and kids, the poor mothers and children of drug kingpins, a very common feature of American sanctions efforts. In fact, sanctions efforts that we're doing exactly against Russian oligarchs and regime figures, which I support, by the way. I support. No, the wives and the children of Russian oligarchs and Mexican cartel kingpins should not benefit from their ill-gotten gains. But I care more about the lives of American citizens, the 100,000 plus American citizens that we lose every single year than anyone else in the world. So the Biden administration's policy, though, is that we'll use this tool against Russians, but we're not going to use it against Mexican cartel members. I think that goes to show you where their priorities are. So again, just to recap, we tried to pass legislation that would have imposed heightened penalties on drug traffickers who misrepresent their drugs and say they don't contain fentanyl. The senator from Illinois blocked it on behalf of the Democrats. Just now, we tried to give the Biden administration more tools to target the cartels that are smuggling these drugs into our country that are killing 100,000 of our fellow citizens. Again, on behalf of Senate Democrats, the senator from Illinois blocked it. I say again, over 108,000 Americans were killed by drugs last year. Yet the Democrats continue to refuse to crack down on drug traffickers and cartel kingpins. Some of my other colleagues are going to offer similar bills today, just like I'm going to offer yet again my permanent fentanyl scheduling bill that would stop the annual kabuki dance here of the Democrats demanding some pro-criminal law just so we can permanently add fentanyl to the Controlled Substance Act schedule. Think about that. At a time when 108,000 Americans are dying every single year. That's not an aggregate number, every single year. The Democrats refuse to act if they don't get something in return on behalf of criminals, if they can't reduce drug sentences for hardened criminals, if they can't let more felons out of prison. It shows a depraved indifference to the lives of our people. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The Democratic whip.
Passing legislation is difficult at any stage in American history. It's increasingly difficult when it's a 50-50 Senate. You have to work it. You have to be willing to sit down with someone from the other side of the aisle and find a co-sponsor so that you have a bipartisan bill. I've seen that work. In fact, I was part of it. It was Senator Chuck Grassley and I that put together the First Step Act, which was part of prison reform, significant prison reform in this country. Who signed the First Step Act? President Donald Trump. Soft on crime? What we did was work out something that was bipartisan, sensible, and really makes a difference in making certain that people currently serving in prison will one day be released, most will, and not return to crime when that happens. I think that was time well spent, but it took a bipartisan effort. I could have come to the floor every day of the week and offered my best idea on how to fight crime. But if you can't pass it on a bipartisan basis in the Senate, it doesn't work. It takes a lot of hard work and a lot of patience and compromise to make a real change in the law. Even if you think you have the best idea on earth, you've got to work at it. I yield the floor.